Hello, brothers, and welcome to Sigma Old Man Channel. Some kids play hide and seek, Sigma kids play hide and analyze your soul. Sounds dramatic, it's not. It's the quiet reality most people missed. While other kids were busy fighting over crayons and cookies, the Sigma male child was busy dissecting human behavior, like a tiny, emotionally detached scientist trapped in a playground of chaos. He wasn't trying to be better than everyone. He was just born feeling like he didn't belong anywhere. And here's a fact that'll mess with your head. Studies show that highly independent children are often misunderstood as emotionally distant or even troubled, when in reality their brains are just wired to process the world differently. Not slower, not faster, deeper. In this video, we're pulling the curtain back on 12 brutal, raw, and mind-bending truths about Sigma males as children. We're not talking about surface-level traits or cheesy lone wolf slogans. This is the real stuff. The kind of childhood most people never see but shapes an entire lifetime. So buckle up, because once you understand how a Sigma male starts out in this world, you'll never see silence, solitude, or childhood weirdness the same way again. And trust me, if you were one of those kids, this is about to hit harder than a dodgeball to the face. Number one, they felt responsible for protecting themselves from their own parents. They felt responsible for protecting themselves from their own parents. Not because their parents were monsters, but because even as kids, Sigma males could sense that the emotional environment at home wasn't stable, whether it was a short fuse, guilt trips, manipulation disguised as love, or simply emotional inconsistency. These kids picked up on it fast. They didn't throw tantrums or cry for attention. They shut down emotionally, not out of rebellion, but out of strategy. It was like they instinctively knew if they didn't build their own inner world, they'd drown in someone else's chaos. The harsh truth is they often saw through their parents in a way that was unsettling. They noticed the fake smiles at dinner, the passive-aggressive comments, the way their parents only really listened when it made them look like good caregivers. They spotted the patterns. One day they'd be praised for being quiet and mature. The next day they'd be scolded for being too withdrawn. So they stopped relying on praise altogether. They stopped relying on comfort. They just handled themselves. Most kids run to their parents when something goes wrong. Sigma kids did the opposite. They withdrew. They learned early that opening up didn't guarantee safety. It could be used against them later. That punishment could be emotional, not just physical. That love could be dangled like a reward. So instead of getting caught in the trap, they built their own emotional firewall. By the time they were 7 or 8, they weren't asking, "Why is Mom sad?" They were asking how much of this sadness is real and how much is being projected onto me. That's not something a kid should ever have to carry, but Sigma males did. They had to become their own emotional filter. They watched everyone, assessed situations quietly, and learned how to self-soothe, because depending on the adults around them often led to more confusion, not clarity. And the most chilling part, no one noticed. To the outside world, they looked fine, polite, quiet, well-behaved. But inside, they were raising themselves, emotionally, mentally, even philosophically. And once you grow up learning that no one's really coming to save you, you stop waiting. That's the Sigma male as a child, surviving the storm with a poker face and already building a fortress no one could break. Number two, they didn't want to belong. They wanted to understand. They didn't want to belong. They wanted to understand. Most kids crave inclusion. They want to be picked for the team, invited to the birthday party, or part of the giggling circle during recess. But for the Sigma male as a child, none of that ever felt urgent. He wasn't being shy. He wasn't being left out. He just couldn't bring himself to care about being part of something that didn't make sense to him. Group behavior felt scripted, forced, often flat-out illogical. Why pretend to like a game just because everyone else did? Why laugh at something that wasn't funny just to blend in? It wasn't fear of rejection, it was rejection of fakeness. If the social ritual didn't hold meaning, he'd opt out without a second thought. That's why he seemed hard to read. Other kids joined the crowd instinctively. Sigma boys stood on the sidelines, not lost, not lonely, but scanning the situation like they were trying to crack a code, and when they did join in, it was brief. One toe dipped in just enough to see if it felt real, and when it didn't, they vanished without explanation. Teachers, parents, and peers often misunderstood this. They assumed he was antisocial, maybe even troubled. But he wasn't. He was curious. He didn't want surface-level connections. He wanted to get it. He wanted to understand why people followed trends, why they cared about popularity, why they chased approval like it was a survival instinct. And when he couldn't find a good answer, he retreated, not with bitterness, but with quiet conviction. This mindset made him seem older than his years. While other kids were busy trying to fit into tiny social boxes, he was mentally poking holes in the entire structure, not to rebel, but because none of it passed his internal logic test, and that's what separates a Sigma male from the rest, even as a child. He wasn't drawn to the crowd because he wasn't wired to be absorbed by the crowd. He needed meaning, clarity, and realness. And if that wasn't on the menu, he'd rather sit alone than eat with the herd. And he was okay with that, more than okay, because understanding was always the goal. Belonging, that was optional. Number 3, they were punished more for their tone than their actions. They were punished more for their tone than their actions. Sigma boys didn't throw tantrums or knock over chairs. They didn't scream in people's faces or run wild through the halls. No, they did something far worse in the eyes of most adults. They spoke the truth without emotion, calm, collected, brutally honest. And that's what really set people off. It wasn't what they said, it was how they said it. That flat, neutral tone that made grown-ups feel exposed, challenged, or judged, even when the kid was just being direct. There's something unnerving about a child who doesn't flinch, doesn't sugarcoat, and doesn't apologize for being logical. Adults are used to kids who plead, cry, or react with fear. Sigma boys gave them none of that. They'd respond to emotional manipulation with a blank stare or a quiet, "That doesn't make sense." And suddenly they were disrespectful. Not because they were being rude, but because they weren't giving the adult the emotional dominance they expected. It messed with the power dynamic. When a kid calmly questions an unfair rule or points out an adult's contradiction with surgical precision, it's like holding up a mirror most people don't want to look into. So instead of self-reflecting, the adult labels the child as difficult, disobedient, too grown, too cold. The truth? He just didn't play the emotional game. He wasn't interested in stroking egos or playing dumb to stay out of trouble. He gave logic instead of drama, and that's exactly what got him punished. Other kids could scream, cry, even lie, and still be forgiven because their emotions looked familiar. But the Sigma boy? He might say something simple like, "You said not to lie, but you just lied to Grandma," and suddenly he's in hot water for being rude. But in his mind, he wasn't starting a fight. He was pointing out an inconsistency, that's all. What made it worse? He didn't look sorry, not because he was arrogant, but because he didn't feel wrong. And in a world where adults crave control over kids' feelings, nothing is more threatening than a child who refuses to hand over his emotional buttons. So yes, he got in trouble, but not for bad behavior. He got in trouble for being emotionally bulletproof, for speaking like someone twice his age, for refusing to play the role of the obedient, expressive little robot. And the world didn't know what to do with that. So they punished what they couldn't control. Number 4, they bonded with fictional characters more than real people. They bonded with fictional characters more than real people, and not because they were antisocial or escaping reality. It was because fiction, ironically, felt more real than the chaos of actual human behavior. In stories, things made sense. Characters had motives. There was cause and effect. Even villains had a backstory. The Sigma male child didn't just watch or read stories. He studied them. He paid attention to how people evolved, how decisions led to consequences, how emotions were expressed and justified. There was structure, there was logic, there was consistency. 3 things painfully missing from most of the adults and kids in his real life. Adults would say one thing and do another. Classmates would be your best friend on Monday and pretend you didn't exist by Friday. But fictional characters, they showed up the same way every time. If a character betrayed someone, there was a reason. If a character broke down, the story had built up to it. Real people just snapped out of nowhere and expected you to deal with it. That inconsistency pushed Sigma boys away from forming deep bonds with most people early on, not because they didn't want connection, but because they needed it to be coherent, not chaotic. Fictional characters became safe emotional experiments. Sigma boys could analyze without getting burned. They'd relate more to Sherlock Holmes or Batman than the kid next to them in class. Not because they wanted to be cool or edgy, but because these characters made decisions based on thought, not peer pressure. They were outcasts with purpose. Lone wolves who weren't looking for sympathy. That hit home. And when things went wrong in life, Sigma boys often turned to those fictional worlds not just for comfort, but for clarity. To figure out how someone else, fictional or not, would handle confusion, betrayal, or loneliness. They trusted the story arc more than someone's word, because people lie, people flip, people disappoint. But stories stayed true to their logic. That's why they got more emotionally attached to books, games, or characters than birthday parties or school events. Fiction gave them something real in a world that felt fake. It gave them consistency in a world that punished them for expecting it. And they weren't living in a fantasy. They were using fiction to survive the irrational mess called reality. Number 5, they were treated like the weird kid, but secretly knew. They were treated like the weird kid, but secretly knew they were playing chess while others were still playing with blocks. They weren't loud, they weren't class clowns, and they definitely weren't trying to win popularity contests. They existed in this strange zone where people didn't quite understand them, so the default label was always weird, too quiet, too intense, too serious. But the Sigma boy wasn't hurt by this label the way people expected. He wasn't desperately trying to fit in, he was studying the madness like a scientist in a lab full of caffeinated monkeys. Other kids would tease or exclude him, thinking they were putting him in his place. But in his mind, he wasn't being rejected, he was gathering data. He noticed how the same kids who mocked him were desperate for attention, terrified of being alone, and confused about who they really were. He watched them shift personalities depending on who was watching. Meanwhile, he stayed consistent. He had no need to perform, and that terrified people more than if he had screamed back. The detachment wasn't apathy, it was control. While others chased approval, he sat back and dissected social patterns like a mini behavioral analyst. He could predict when someone would start drama just by the way they twitched or changed tone. He could sense when someone was lying even before the lie left their mouth. And it gave him this quiet confidence, not arrogance, just an inner knowing that he was wired differently, sharper, colder, more aware. So even when he was left out, he wasn't sulking. He was building inner clarity. He knew he wasn't the same, and he never wanted to be. He didn't envy the loud kids or the popular ones. He watched them spiral over minor stuff and thought, why would I want that chaos in my life? He wasn't planning revenge because he didn't need to win a petty game. He was too busy learning how people work. That's what made him different. While everyone else was obsessed with being seen, he was mastering the art of seeing through people. And once you see through everything, it's hard to unsee. That's why he could handle being the weird kid. Deep down, he knew they weren't even playing the same game. Number 6, they developed emotional independence, not by choice, but by necessity. They developed emotional independence not by choice, but by necessity. People loved to romanticize solitude, but for Sigma boys, it wasn't some cool, edgy rebellion. It was survival. They weren't isolating themselves because they didn't like people. They were isolating because being around people often felt like emotional chaos. They were surrounded by noise, overreactions, shallow thinking, and mood swings from adults and peers alike. And trying to make sense of it all with a rational mind was like trying to solve a math equation in the middle of a screaming match. So they shut the door. Not out of pride, but out of mental exhaustion. They weren't the kind of kids who cried just to be comforted. They learned early that showing vulnerability didn't guarantee safety. Sometimes it brought the opposite: mockery, dismissal, or being told to toughen up. So they did, but not in the way most people understand. They didn't become numb, they became self-contained. If they were sad, they figured out why before they told anyone. If they were angry, they processed it privately. They didn't explode, they absorbed until it was safe, if it ever was. It's easy to judge that kind of emotional distance as cold or too mature, but no one ever asks what environment forced that kid to become emotionally self-sufficient at such a young age. People forget that kids naturally seek connection until life teaches them it's not always available or safe. And once a Sigma boy sees that lesson play out enough times, once he sees that adults can be emotionally unstable and kids can be emotionally cruel, he stops outsourcing his emotional well-being. He builds an inner system, a firewall, a way to feel without needing permission or validation from anyone else. He didn't do it because he wanted to grow up fast. He did it because the emotional environment around him gave him no real choice. And while that independence would later become a source of power as a child, it was lonely. He had to teach himself how to process feelings most people didn't even have names for. He had to be his own safe space. And the saddest part, most people never even noticed what he was carrying, because he carried it so well. Number 7, their curiosity wasn't loud, it was dangerous. Their curiosity wasn't loud, it was dangerous. While other kids were raising their hands every 5 seconds asking why the sky is blue or how dinosaurs died, the Sigma boy was sitting there quietly, then dropping one question that made the whole room go still. He wasn't trying to be edgy. He wasn't even trying to provoke. He just genuinely wanted to understand, and his mind naturally gravitated toward the cracks no one else noticed, the things that didn't add up, the moments where logic vanished and hypocrisy stepped in, wearing a smile. Adults love curious children as long as the questions stay within safe territory. But Sigma boys didn't play by that rule. They could spot a contradiction in someone's story like a laser cutting through fog. A teacher would say, "Always tell the truth," and the Sigma boy would respond, "Then why did you lie to the principal about being late?" And it wasn't snarky, it was genuine. He wasn't trying to call them out, he was trying to understand the rules. But when the rules changed based on mood, ego, or authority, he started seeing the game for what it was, inconsistent and rigged. That's what made his curiosity so unsettling. He didn't ask about things. He asked about people, their behavior, their motives, their contradictions, and not in a dramatic confrontational way. He was disturbingly calm, detached. That's what got under people's skin. He'd ask questions most adults had spent years avoiding, questions they didn't even want to ask themselves, questions that held up a mirror they weren't ready to look into. It's why some adults labeled him as too intense or difficult, not because he misbehaved, but because he disrupted the emotional comfort zone. He made people feel seen in ways they didn't ask for. And since they couldn't punish him for yelling or being rude, they punished the tone of his question, the stillness, the fact that he didn't flinch while asking it. He wasn't the loud, curious kid. He was the silent observer, the one who'd been watching long enough to ask the one question that unraveled your carefully rehearsed persona. And you never saw it coming. That's what made him different. That's what made his curiosity dangerous. Number 8, they were always 10 mental steps ahead, which made them chronically bored. They were always 10 mental steps ahead, which made them chronically bored, and not in a fidgety, can't sit still kind of way. They weren't bouncing off the walls or disrupting the class. They were zoning out because everything around them moved in slow motion. While everyone else was just starting to grasp a concept, they had already broken it apart, tested it from 5 different angles and found its flaws. They weren't impatient. They were just intellectually suffocating. This wasn't ADHD. It wasn't a lack of focus. It was the opposite. They had hyper-focus, but only when something actually stimulated their mind. And let's be honest, school rarely did, repeating the same thing 10 times, explaining ideas they already understood in the first sentence. That wasn't learning, that was punishment. So they checked out, not because they didn't care, but because their brain was already on the next level, while the world around them was still waiting for the green light. Same thing in conversations. While other kids were cracking jokes and talking about cartoons, the Sigma boy was processing body language, subtext, and tone shifts like a human lie detector. He wasn't being antisocial, he was just light years ahead in how he thought, felt, and analyzed. And when you're the only one in a room mentally sprinting while everyone else is crawling, the boredom isn't just physical, it's existential. To survive it, they built inner worlds, whole mental universes filled with complexity, logic, stories, structures, anything that actually challenged them. They became quiet daydreamers, not because they were passive, but because their mind was too busy building empires while everyone else was stuck on basic math. Teachers thought they were distracted, peers thought they were weird, but truthfully, they were just underwhelmed. And when boredom hits a mind that sharp, it doesn't just drift, it creates. That's why so many Sigma males as kids grew up to be innovators, strategists, and visionaries, because they had no choice but to invent stimulation when the world failed to provide it. They didn't just think differently, they thought faster, and nobody could keep up, so they stopped trying to slow down. They learned to live in their head because it was the only place that could keep up with them. Number 9, they noticed patterns adults didn't want them to see. They noticed patterns adults didn't want them to see. While most kids were busy being kids, the Sigma boy was busy reading the room, and not in a shallow way. He was tracking behavior like a seasoned analyst. He remembered who got praised and who got ignored, who the teacher always called on, and who mysteriously got out of trouble again and again. He picked up on the micro-signals, tone changes, body language, fake smiles, and filed them away like silent evidence. Adults assumed he wasn't paying attention, but that was the trick. Sigma boys observed from the shadows. They didn't react. They didn't blurt things out. They just watched, quietly, with an eerie kind of precision. And what made it even more unnerving was that their memory wasn't just strong, it was strategic. They didn't remember everything. They remembered what mattered. Who was consistent, who wasn't. Who talked about values and who actually lived by them. They could detect emotional hypocrisy like radar. And once they saw it, they couldn't unsee it. They'd notice when a teacher called one student a natural leader for being outspoken, but called another disruptive for doing the same thing. They'd catch when a parent said, "We don't lie," then bent the truth to avoid a confrontation. These contradictions didn't just confuse them, they activated something. Not anger, not rebellion, awareness, a sharp internal click that whispered, "This is the game, this is how it works." And they didn't confront people about it. That wasn't their style. They just logged it quietly, accurately. And over time, their trust in adults started to erode, not from trauma or drama, but from repeated, undeniable proof that most people don't live what they preach. The scary part? If they wanted to, they could use that memory like a weapon. They had the receipts, the timeline, the patterns. But most of the time, they didn't. Not because they couldn't, but because they were too busy analyzing the deeper pattern. Why people lie, why power works the way it does, why truth is uncomfortable for most. That's what made them different. They weren't trying to expose people, they were trying to understand them. But in doing so, they often saw way more than they were supposed to. And once you can read people that well, innocence doesn't come back. Only clarity does. Number 10. They felt more lonely around people than alone. They felt more lonely around people than alone. It's a brutal reality for Sigma boys that gets overlooked all the time. You'd think being surrounded by friends or family would ease that feeling of isolation, but for them, it often made the ache worse. It wasn't about the number of people in the room, it was about the quality of connection. Being physically present with others didn't mean anything if the conversations were shallow, the emotions fake, or the values completely off. They weren't craving small talk or forced friendships. They wanted something real, something that resonated on a deeper level. But when most people around them operated on autopilot, recycling the same social scripts and surface-level emotions, it created an invisible wall. They'd watch groups laughing at jokes they didn't find funny or engaging in drama they didn't understand, and a strange emptiness crept in. It wasn't loneliness because no one was there, it was loneliness because no one was there in the way that mattered. This kind of loneliness is different from feeling left out or rejected. It's not about exclusion, it's about emotional mismatch. They could be at a birthday party surrounded by faces, yet feel like they were watching the whole scene from behind glass, unable to step inside. The energy didn't align, the vibe wasn't theirs. And that disconnect hit harder than any actual solitude ever could. Sometimes being alone was a relief. At least alone, they could breathe, think, and feel without pretending. They didn't have to fake interest, laugh on cue, or play along with meaningless social games. Alone, they found clarity and calm. Surrounded by people, they found confusion and noise. This paradox, feeling lonelier in crowds than in solitude, shaped how they moved through life. It taught them to be self-reliant emotionally, but also carved out a quiet sadness that few ever saw. They didn't talk about it because explaining that kind of loneliness sounded weird to most ears. So they bottled it up, smiling on the outside while feeling like a ghost at the party on the inside. In the end, their loneliness wasn't about not having people. It was about not having the right people. And that made all the difference. Number 11. They grew up realizing they were everyone's confidant, but no one's priority. They grew up realizing they were everyone's confidant, but no one's priority. From an early age, Sigma boys became the silent vaults of their friends' secrets, the safe place where worries, fears, and confessions poured out. People trusted them, not because they were loud or attention-seeking, but because they listened without judgment. with a calm that made others feel seen and understood. They had this rare ability to hold space for others' chaos without getting tangled in it. But here's the kicker. While everyone unloaded their emotional baggage on them, when the tables turned and they needed support, they found themselves empty-handed. No one showed up with the same quiet presence. No one asked how they were really doing. Even as kids, they were emotionally invisible in their own lives. They were the go-to for advice, comfort, and shoulder to cry on. But their own struggles were met with awkward silences or quick changes of subject. This wasn't because people were mean or uncaring. It was more like an unspoken social contract they never agreed to, but were stuck with. They became the emotional dumpsters for others because they didn't demand attention or make noise about their feelings. They accepted the role out of necessity. Better to be the listener than the misunderstood kid screaming for help no one understood. The irony. Carrying everyone else's emotional weight without anyone carrying theirs builds a strange kind of loneliness. It's a heavy solitude disguised by the mask of calm reliability. Over time, Sigma boys learn to guard their vulnerability tightly because experience has taught them that opening up rarely changes anything. People want the strong one who listens, not the one who breaks. So they keep their struggles tucked away, invisible by design. They become experts at managing their own emotions quietly, making sure their pain doesn't disrupt the social order they're so good at navigating. It's a lonely balance, being everyone's secret keeper while being nobody's priority. And it shapes them into adults who don't just tolerate solitude. They depend on it because it's the only place where their own voice finally matters. Number 12. They questioned authority before they even knew what authority was. They questioned authority before they even knew what authority was. While most kids were trying to figure out how to color inside the lines, Sigma boys were already wondering who decided where the lines went and why everyone agreed to follow them. They weren't defiant for the sake of rebellion. They weren't loud troublemakers looking for chaos. What they were, deep down, was unconvinced. Unconvinced by rules that didn't make logical sense. Unconvinced by adults who said, "Because I said so," like it was a valid explanation. Unconvinced that authority meant wisdom just because someone was taller or wore a name tag. They weren't trying to overthrow the system, they just couldn't pretend it made sense when it didn't. That made them quietly dangerous in structured environments. Teachers saw it as attitude. Parents sometimes saw it as disrespect. But the truth was, these boys weren't trying to be difficult. They were trying to make sense of a world that demanded obedience without offering coherence. A teacher says, "Be quiet," then yells at the class. A rule says no talking, but another kid gets praised for asking a question. The inconsistency short-circuited something in the Sigma brain. It didn't add up. And when things don't add up, Sigma boys don't play along. And they weren't emotional about it. That's what made adults even more uneasy. There was no tantrum, no rage, just a calm, steady look that said, "This doesn't make sense to me, and I'm not going to fake that it does." They opted out in subtle ways, doing the assignment their way, not the approved way, following the spirit of a rule, but not the letter. They weren't trying to be smarter than everyone else. They were simply wired to think first instead of submit. This internal wiring meant they didn't blindly accept titles, uniforms, or traditions. They looked at behavior, not labels. If someone in power acted unfairly, the Sigma boy mentally withdrew respect, regardless of age, position, or status. And that mental withdrawal, it was silent, but absolute. From that moment on, he stopped playing the social game and started watching it like a bored chess master waiting for a worthy opponent. They didn't need to understand the word authority to know when it was hollow. Their instinct told them what most adults still ignore. Respect is earned, not inherited. And if no one around them was earning it, they gave it to themselves instead. Growing up as a Sigma male is not just about being different. It's about navigating a world that often doesn't know what to do with someone who sees too clearly, thinks too deeply, and feels too quietly. These boys don't just march to their own beat. They compose an entirely new rhythm that others rarely hear. From being misunderstood observers to silent strategists, from emotional confidants who go unseen to minds racing miles ahead of their peers, their childhoods are a complex blend of brilliance and isolation. What makes their story extraordinary isn't just the challenges they face, but the resilience they build in response. They learn early that fitting in isn't the goal. Understanding themselves and the world around them is. They discover that emotional independence isn't a choice, but a necessity, forged in moments when the noise of the crowd drowns out their inner voice. And in that solitude, they cultivate something rare, a clarity of thought, a sharpness of insight, and a calm strength that often goes unnoticed but never fades. It's easy to mistake their quietness for detachment or their aloofness for disinterest. But beneath the surface lies a mind constantly working, analyzing, and evolving. They live in mental worlds, richer and more intricate than most can imagine, not because they want to escape reality, but because reality itself often feels shallow and uninspiring. Their loneliness, paradoxically, is both a burden and a gift, a silent forge where their extraordinary nature is hammered into something unbreakable. So the next time you encounter a Sigma male, especially the kid who seems lost in thought or the quiet one at the back of the room, remember this. Beneath that calm exterior is a world of complexity, pain, and profound intelligence. They're not just drifting through childhood, they're quietly rewriting the rules on what it means to grow, to feel, and ultimately to thrive. Their journey isn't about fitting into the mold society hands them, it's about breaking the mold entirely and crafting a life uniquely their own. And that, in the end, is the most remarkable story of all. If this deep dive into the world of Sigma males resonated with you, don't just scroll past. Hit that subscribe button and join the conversation. Like what you heard? Smash that like button to let us know we're on the right track. Got thoughts, experiences, or questions? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from you and building this community together. And hey, if you know someone who's walking that Sigma path or just needs to understand it better, share this video with them. Let's keep the conversation going and uncover the extraordinary, one story at a time.